try to keep myself a little bit organized is the word, I guess. But how you been? I feel like we haven't talked very in a while.
Yeah, but it's strange to me to think that we visited you guys, but it was in 2021, so it was like 18 months ago.
Speaking of which, I do have here that I need to re-verify your booking. I have you booked for April of 2024. It says here for a total solar eclipse, drinking, and board games.
Yeah, in that order.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
Yeah, I'm telling you, we went to Wyoming to see the one in 2017, and it is the most amazing natural world thing I have ever seen in my life. It's just there are no words to describe it.
So you have seen one?
Yeah, back in 2017, which is why I knew there was one coming in 2024. But
I wasn't sure if you had seen one when you first when you first messaged me or us about that. But I've seen eclipses before, a couple different ones. Like I've seen a lunar one, a solar one, but I never seen a total one. I knew the total was coming in the next few years, but to hit because we live here, right? So it was like when that was happening, there was a big news article about like, yeah, we're having a solar eclipse, but in 8 years or 7 years or whatever it is.
It seemed like a long time ago, but time goes by. I was like, man, that's a long time for 2024. But so we saw the total one in Wyoming. I looked at the path of totality and said, okay, well, where do I think the best weather will be? And so Wyoming, it was great. It was like clear blue sky. It turns out that for most of the country on that day, even where there were clouds, they parted at just the right time. So it was like blind ass luck. But so this time when I looked at it, in that time of year, there's really no lock. In April, there's typically rain showers and everything else. But I think what we'll try to do is if we base ourselves in the Dallas area, which is right on the path of totality, if you get up that morning and the weather forecast says it's going to be cloudy, well, you just start looking around to see if any place is going to be not cloudy, and then you drive there by, you got time. Right. But the other difference is the length of totality for this one is very different. So the one we saw in Wyoming, I think it was like 2.5 minutes, something like that. The Dallas area is going to be over 4 minutes, which is pretty cool. Yeah. It's a really long duration for totality. It's just a matter of, how things line up. But so we're looking forward to that. It'll be cool.
That's really cool. I didn't realize it was supposed to be a long one, because usually with any sort of celestial activity that we get to witness, they are not long. Like, ooh, a meteor shower is happening. It's like, cool, you'll see a couple and they just go by in like a second. It's so different. And then even like you said, the eclipse before was only about 2.5 minutes. And even, after about, I would say probably about 90 seconds of it here where it wasn't total, you just saw it going across. You're like, this is really cool. But you didn't really have anything to look forward to with that moment of full totality. And so I'm excited. I'm very excited for it.
Yeah. I mean, you could pick up your binoculars and stare right at it during the eclipse, right? When it's in totality. And you with binoculars, you can stare and see the corona and everything, which is just crazy.
Oh, that's really cool.
It's really cool. Yeah. And so, but when the time is up, you'll know it, because it's like, suddenly it's like,
yeah.
Blinked. Yeah. But it's pretty cool.
I was reading an article recently on I think Vox, but it was about how a third of humanity now lives in a life where they never see the Milky Way galaxy in the night sky.
That's pretty weird, isn't it?
And then 80% of the United States and 80% of Americans live that way, and like 60% of Europe. And it wasn't until I read that I realized, one, I've never seen it. And really? Two, old art makes a lot more sense. Right? Like when I think about art from more than 150 years ago of night skies, it makes a lot more sense.
I I grew up in Yuma, Arizona, and I was in the Boy Scouts up through high school. And when we would go camping, it's the freaking desert. It's not like there's some great place to go, but when you went out in the desert and you went past like some of we call them mountains, but most of the people in the world wouldn't call them that. They're not that tall, maybe 600-700 feet down there. But when you went on the backside of those, and Yuma at the time was only in the 30 to 50,000 people range. Mm-hmm. So if you're about 20 miles away and had a mountain range between you and it, there was no source of light. So when you turned off all the flashlights and the campfire was out, it was amazing what you could see, which by the way, is similar to when you're on a ship in the middle of the ocean.
Right. And that's one of the I was going to ask you that later on, because I was like, I would assume that you've seen the Milky Way. I would assume you've probably seen the Northern Lights, not even Navy related, just Sweden related with Julia. And like other things like that. So
I have not seen the Northern Lights. No, that's as a matter of fact, the one time I was in Norway above the Arctic Circle, it was the summertime. So instead, what I got was doing a little bit of bar hopping at midnight when it was still daylight, which is pretty weird. But now I have a very specific memory of on my first ship. We went to Australia. And we crossed the equator. Of course, there's a big Navy ceremony you do when you cross the equator. And
do you have your? Sorry. Keep going.
No, go ahead. My shellback certificate.
I was going to ask if you had the turtle tattoo.
Oh no, I don't have any tattoos. I'm boring that way.
I wasn't sure.
So if you go south of the equator, of course, or just crossing the equator is shellback, and there's a shellback ceremony which varies from ship to ship, and over the years it's kind of ebbed and flowed with sometimes it's considered hazing, so it's like, oh, we couldn't do that. On my second ship, we went to Australia and we crossed the equator. The captain decided what we were going to do is we were going to like have a nice dinner and watch a movie, which wasn't exactly a shellback ceremony, right?
Right.
On my third ship, I managed to cross the equator on all three ships that I was on. On my third ship was a ballistic missile submarine. And we crossed the equator on that ship. And the captain happened to be a polywog. But he said, I have to maintain, like supervision. I have to maintain like a clear picture of what's going on. So XO, you're in charge. And I'm like, well, what do you want to do? And he goes, I want the whole thing. And I'm like, okay. So we did a full up shellback ceremony. I was the second senior shellback, meaning I had been the shellback for the second longest time on the ship.
Okay.
And which made me Davy Jones for the ceremony, which was kind of cool. So I'm writing up all the dialogue and stuff, and it was kind of fun. So there's two specific designations for shellbacks if you happen to cross at just the right place. So if you happen to cross the equator at 180 and the equator, then that's a golden shellback. Strangely enough, there's an equivalent when you cross the prime meridian at the
zero
equator,
and equator,
which is an emerald shellback. And I'm one of the few people who has both of those.
Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah. The emerald shellback, it's not on a great circle route. So unless you're going there for a specific reason, there's no reason you would ever go there.
Right.
It's really it's off the path. So that's kind of neat.
I know it's not very common just because it's almost on land. Like when you look at a map of the world, it's so close in comparison to the rest of the ocean, right? Like you're just south of Africa. You're kind of in that cove.
Benin, I think. Mm-hmm. It's in the Bight of Benin, which I actually worked into my dialogue for Davy Jones. So
smart. I like it.
Benin, but yeah. So what got me on this topic? Yeah, you're right. It's about 100, maybe 200 miles off the coast, which compared to Africa is like point blank range, right?
Yeah, and also compared to like where you travel in a naval ship, being 100 miles off the coast you're near land.
Yeah, exactly. So, which is something that I still get today. People talk about solutions to various problems, like how you could flood the ocean with small vehicles, and that way you could like detect anything that was out there. And I'm like,
you don't know how large the ocean is.
I don't think you comprehend the scale of your problem. It's on a ballistic missile submarine, your patrol area at a particular time, the water space you own could be as big as Georgia.
Yeah.
And so let's just say that your ship is detectable. You're having a bad day. It's detectable at a 10-mile range. Now put a 10-mile radius circle on Georgia and tell me how much trouble you have finding that, right?
When Rachel and I lived in Atlanta in our last apartment, we lived there. I traveled 20 miles to work and she traveled 35 miles to work just from our apartment complex. So yeah, that's nothing.
Yeah. And that's of course the state of Georgia in the middle of the Atlantic is
right.
And the Pacific, of course, is twice the size of the Atlantic, at least. You know, 1/3 of the Earth's surface practically is. Anyway, it's huge. So, what I was going to mention, what got me on this topic when you talk about the Milky Way, I have a very specific memory of when we were going to Australia. We surfaced the ship, and I happened to be on the midwatch, so midnight to 6. So I go up to the bridge and I'd asked beforehand if it was okay if I switched off the lights for a little while because we're in the middle of nowhere, right? It's funny if you get on great circle routes that connect major ports and major choke points, then those things can almost be like freeways in some parts of the ocean, like in the South China Sea. The traffic that's going to the Malacca Strait all lines up in one place, and it's literally like a freeway in the middle of the ocean.
Yeah.
But when you're going to Australia, there's not a lot of that, right? Unless you happen to be on one of those great circle routes. So we surface, there's nobody around, there's no moon, and I just switch off all the lights that I can, that I have access to, and it's just the sky. And it's amazing what you can see. I mean, we're 200 miles off the coast. There's no light, and the Milky Way, easy to see. Southern Cross, pretty obvious. At the time, I thought, and this may still be my perception, was there are more stars with color in the Southern Hemisphere to see, like greens and oranges, which I don't see a lot of in the Northern Hemisphere. But the other thing was, to an extent, it almost felt like you had woken up and you were on another planet because all the constellations are upside down.
Yeah.
So that was weird. First off, there's a bunch of stars you've never seen before because you're way far south. And then the ones that you do recognize are inverse. It was like, well, that's odd. So that was a strange thing to see. On another ship, we happened to be doing some really extended operations up at periscope depth. And at the time, we're still using optical scopes. The submarines today have started to get away from that. They have cameras up there instead of penetrating periscopes. They've just got a camera on the end of a mast. Yeah. And the optical periscope could go up to 24 times magnification. So what that lets you do is, after you were careful that there's, you've made your visual searches and there's nothing around, you could pick out Jupiter, go to 24 power. You could count the moons, and between night to night. Yeah, from night to night, you could see them. They would move from place to place. The image would change, and then on that particular run, there was I think it was Kohoutek. There was a comet back then. It was in 1996, 97, something like that. And so there was that comet, and the weapons officer and I would take turns trying to outperform who could get the most, snapshots of the comet or something like that. Which was kind of fun. The little things you do to try to keep yourself entertained.
So this past weekend, I was doing a puzzle. My mom came to visit while Rachel was out of town, and we made a puzzle of my favorite map, which is a map from the 1590s of the world. And my mom kept asking me, how in 400 years ago did they have a map that in Europe was incredibly accurate? It's a world map. The rest of it is close or absolute nonsense. But Europe, Northern Africa are so detailed, especially the Mediterranean Sea, and between India and Somalia. That area is, traveled constantly for thousands of years. And I was like, well, you see, when you're really bored and all you have is a boat and some paper, you just every day will look at the same thing and look for differences to entertain yourself. Like that's all you have to do. And you're sitting here going, it's just what you do when you're out in the middle of nowhere and you have nothing else to do. And you look up at the sky or look around you, and it's fascinating. I hope to one day kind of go off to nowhere and see the sky like that. Like Rachel and I have been in the southern hemisphere by about, I don't know, 400 feet, half a mile. Like we weren't super far. Quito is just north of the equator, and we had to travel down to cross over. So it's not like I've really taken in that different night sky.
How far south is the Galapagos?
The Galapagos is actually further north.
Really?
I think. I'm trying to think.
Oh, you're right. I thought the Galapagos were further south, but they're just west of Ecuador, and they are pretty much right at the equator.
Yeah. It always threw me off. They were always further north than I expected them to be too, which is why it kind of stuck in my head. Yeah. But yeah, fascinating. That's another great pivot too, because you kept saying ship. And I was like, oh, okay, so this was time when he was on a ship. And then you said, my third ship was a ballistic submarine. And I went, okay, he refers to ship as every type of vessel that's waterfaring. And now I'm more confused. So
yeah, I shifted to that somewhat deliberately because when you say boat, people start thinking other things. So it's kind of funny if you're, when you're ashore, it's common for people to say, hey, I'm going down to the ship or I'm going down to the boat. You could say either one, right?
Right.
When you're underway, you typically talk about the boat. And I think it just varies from person to person. I think it's funny, though, every once in a while when I'll comment on something and people say, well, obviously you don't know what you're talking about because submariners call it a boat. And I'm like, but not every time,
right,
and not universally. Right. I mean, the thing is freaking enormous, right? It's as big as it's as big as a Arleigh Burke destroyer as far as displacement goes. I mean, it's a big ship. But when you see a submarine on the surface, it's like an ice cube. You're seeing 1/9 of the thing. And when you see a picture of one in the dry dock, like you can see like right there.
Yeah.
The thing is an enormous steel cylinder with a round end and a pointy end. It's huge, and the new submarines are even bigger. And the ballistic missile submarines are as long as the Washington Monument is tall. So those things are huge, right?
Wow.
So it's historically they called them boats back in World War II. It's stuck. Everything in the U.S. submarine force traces itself to World War II. Right? World War II submarining in the Pacific. If you ask any submariner, like, what are your roots? They're going to say it's all those World War II submariners, because that's all the traditions and, if you will, the glory of the submarine force goes back to then. And then you've got a lot of stories from the Cold War, which are a lot less well known because, it
was the Cold War.
They don't declassify a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, everything was done in secret, or as close to secret as could be.
Yeah, every once in a while, something will get declassified that's really, really cool. But it's infrequent, and it's just a tidbit, right?
How many ships in total were you on? You said your third ship
4
earlier. You were on 4. And
4?
were they all subs?
Yeah.
Okay.
So typically, I won't say typically, if you join the submarine force, you're never going to be serving on a surface ship like a surface warship. You just never would. Your only ships will ever be on are submarines. And then in between those, you have shore tours. So for the first 20 years of my career, you start off with a training pipeline. Then you get to your first ship. After that, you go to shore for a couple of years and you go back to a ship. You go to shore for a couple of years, you go back to a ship, shore for a couple of years, and then you go to your, for officers, that fourth ship, if you get to one, would be your command tour. So that the only way you get to 4 as an officer, if that's what you're doing. But yeah, so 3 of those ships were fast attack nuclear submarines, and the third one I was on was a ballistic missile submarine.
All right, you're gonna have to help me out here. What was your rank at retirement?
I was a captain, which would be the equivalent of a colonel in the other services.
Okay. As a captain, would you still command on a ship, or were you more stationed somewhere else? So sure. So
in the submarine force, all of our submarine, well, not all of our submarines, there's an exception now. The vast majority of our submarines, so the ballistic missile submarines and the attack submarines are all commanded by O5s, commanders.
Okay.
And then after
Captain
that
is
tour,
07? Is that what you told me before?
06.
06. Okay.
Yeah, the admiral ranks start at 07.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so all of those ships, there are 4 submarines, which are guided missile submarines. They have a very, very strange operational cycle. Those are commanded by second tour commanding officers who are 06s. But all the other ships, and the one I commanded was as an 05 as a commander. And that's where you get into this little kind of funny nuance where, well, you're the captain of the ship. So you're a commander, but everybody calls you captain, which is kind of cool. They called me captain for 12 years of my life, which is really nice. So after your command tour, if you are fortunate enough to get picked up for major command, like I did, I went back out to Guam and had command of Submarine Squadron 15, which is responsible for the training and preparation of 4 submarines that are based in Guam. And so those 4 commanding officers all work directly for me. But I was only ever underway on those ships for a few days at a time over different courses of the year as we were doing examinations on them. If you go to the surface Navy, the cruisers are commanded by 06s. They're second tour commanding officers. Well, there's a slight exception to that.
We can speak in generalities.
The aircraft carriers are commanded by 06s, but very senior 06s. They have a very demanding training path to get to command of an aircraft carrier. You have to have command of a deep draft ship before they could go to the aircraft carrier. And the funny thing about that is, of course, they're all pilots, right? They're all flight officers. I'll say that. They could be backseaters, they could be front seaters, but they're all aviators. But if you're going to command of a nuclear powered ship, then you are personally responsible for the certification of the nuclear operators on that ship, which means Naval Reactors in DC has to approve you as being able to fulfill that duty.
Right.
Because there is no Nuclear Regulatory Commission oversight of nuclear reactors. It's a separate entity. Yeah. And even though we operate about the same number of reactors as the civilian world and the Navy world. So here's the funny thing. I can remember this is back in the fall of 2005. I'm in the command pipeline and I'm living in the DC area and I'm going to the Navy Yard every day to go to Naval Reactors to study your butt off and take a bunch of exams that, you much more in depth than you've seen stuff before. Yeah. And it's all because they want you to be extremely confident in your knowledge of how the propulsion plant works. And you go there for 3.5, 4 months. Well, in my class, there are 10 of us submariners. We've been doing nothing but nuclear power for the last 18 years, right?
Yeah. Decades.
From 6 months after graduation from college, it's basically nuclear power, right? Yeah. With occasional breaks on shore duty, but when you're on a ship, you still have nuclear power, right? Yeah. Even if you're not in a nuclear related job, you're required to still maintain that level of familiarity and knowledge in general. Well,
yeah, because you could get moved to another ship that is.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So there you are at Naval Reactors, taking all these exams to allow Naval Reactors to bless you and say you're allowed to go have command of one of our submarines. Yeah. Okay. In that same group of people, we had 2 aviators. They have never done anything with nuclear power, right? So after they do all this other stuff, they've had command of a squadron of aircraft. They have gone then, when they got selected for nuclear power, they went to nuclear power school, which is now in Charleston, and that's 6 months. By the way, I looked this up one time. The curriculum in that 6 months is about 80% in common with a master's degree in nuclear engineering from most colleges. It's brutal.
What motivated you to join the Navy? I know you mentioned that you wanted to be an engineer. Was that something that came about after you joined, or was that kind of your goal always?
Let's wind the clock back and I'll try to give you some context here. Yeah. So if you had asked me in high school, do you want to be an engineer? I'd be like, I don't know what you're talking about. So of course, my dad was a Marine Corps fighter pilot, Marine Corps pilot, and I grew up in Yuma, Arizona, near Marine Corps Air Station. So until my dad got out of the Marine Corps in 1976, when I was 10 years old, all of his friends are Marines. They're all pilots. Right. And so you see planes, you see tactical jets every single day. All the people are all talking about, pilot stuff, right? Yeah. That pilot should, all that stuff. And so that's just what I grew up around. And I always planned on joining the military. And my plan was I was going to join I was going to be a Marine Corps pilot. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be like my dad, right? I was going to be a Marine Corps pilot. So go to the Naval Academy and everything's great. And in your junior year, they do pre-commissioning physicals toward the end of the academic year. And I remember the guy's checking my eyes and he's like, "So what else is on your mind besides being a pilot?"
Yeah. Yeah.
And Julie can tell you that story. It was like somebody shot your dog. I mean, I was just like completely dejected, right? And so for a little while, you think about it, this is in the mid to late 1980s, and at the time there was no corrective surgery that was accepted by the Navy. Yeah. And so having 20/20 vision was the go/no-go test for if you could be a pilot.
Yeah.
I'm at the point where it's like, well, you're not going to be a pilot. Oh, okay.
But you're already 3 years into the Naval Academy.
Yeah. So if you start the first day of your junior year, you're committed to some kind of payback to the Navy. So if you quit anytime in your first 2 years, anytime before you start your junior year, you can just leave and it's no problem. But people who get kicked out in their junior year end up in the enlisted Navy as an unrated seaman for like 2 years. And it's like, that's just penance is what, that is. It's not like they care. It's just, we're just jettisoning you and you're going to give us some blood. Okay, thanks. Which doesn't happen to that many people. It happened to one of my plebeian roommates, as a matter of fact. But when you're stupid, eventually you get caught. So, so after I go rapidly through the 5 phases of grief, I'm like, well, what am I going to do? Okay, first, are you going to be a Marine and be somebody in the infantry? And the answer to that was no.
No.
Okay. Are you going to be a backseater, in an airplane? And at the time, I didn't think there was a lot to that. I just didn't think it was all that interesting. I'll admit that I didn't know much about it. There's a great YouTube channel called, and the name who runs is Ward Carroll. He was an F-14 backseater. And you hear him talk about this stuff and it's like, okay, that would have been kind of cool. That right. There would have been some badass we could do with that, right? Okay. But at the time I was like, if I'm not flying the damn thing, I don't think I want to be in the plane, right? That's not what I want to do.
Yeah.
So I was like, okay, well, I'm not going to do that. All right. Well, that means I'm going to sea. All right. Going to sea. Well, if I'm going to sea, I should probably get paid for it. So I should probably find out what this submarine thing is like. Yeah. So the summer between my junior and senior year, which is not called that at the Naval Academy, by the way, but the summer between my junior and my senior year, to avoid jargon,
I appreciate that.
I took a midshipman cruise on a submarine.
Yeah.
And so I flew out with me and a few others. I flew out to Portugal and we got on board a submarine and took it as it came back from a deployment to the Mediterranean back to the United States. And as much as there were difficult things about it, I just loved everything about it. I loved the fact that they respected knowledge of what you were doing more than almost anything else. It didn't matter if you were if you were an E5, a petty officer second class, or if you were a lieutenant. If you're the one who knew the answer, then that was who people listened to. Right. The level of knowledge of everybody on the ship about everything about the ship was just, I thought it was just crazy. And I thought, okay, I can do this. And so then November of your first class year, all the people who are interested in nuclear power have to go to naval reactors. Yeah. And you do oral interviews. So you do 2 technical interviews, and then you do an interview with the admiral himself. To this day, Rick Over back in the 1950s started you can call it a tradition, but he put in place the practice where every officer going into nuclear power interviews personally with the 4-star in charge of the nuclear propulsion program. And so depending on whether that guy says this or this is the final answer. There's no do-overs, right? So anyways, I was a computer science major, and while I had the same kind of math and electrical engineering as a lot of people, I didn't have a lot of applied knowledge of those kind of things, right? It was just things you needed to have. And so I'm like, man, what are they going to ask me at this stupid interview? And so the first one, the guy he asked me a lot of pretty simple math questions. Like he says, okay, so draw a rectangle.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. He says, now draw a rectangle inside that one, but at an angle, not like parallel. I'm like, okay. He goes, what do you need to calculate the area between the two rectangles? And I was like, I need like the length and the height of both. And he goes, is that it? Yes. He goes, okay, so draw a triangle. And then the next guy just talked to me for 30 minutes about computer languages, programming languages.
Yeah.
Which, of course, I was ready and eager to talk about. And then I had my interview with the 4-star. It turns out that my future commanding officer for my first ship was probably the guy that showed me into his office that day.
Oh, wow.
When we did the math and talked about it, I'm like, wow, yeah, that's cool. That was you. Of course, you don't remember, right? You're just like mortified. You got like terrified to sit down in front of this 4-star who holds your career in his hands, right?
And you also don't think about like the guy who's leading you in as someone to remember anyway, because it's the 4-star who's important. At that time.
You also have to remember that at that time, all the officers at Naval Reactors came to work in civilian clothes every day.
Mm-hmm.
Because Rickover didn't want people to feel like there was a difference between them, right?
Yeah.
It was like, no, we're all Naval Reactors. It's not officers and civilians.
Well, that also helps with what you've been talking about as well, of every person needs to have the knowledge, and whoever has the most knowledge about the specific thing is who we're going to. And if everyone's just in civilian streets, like, that helps cut through a lot of that, because I know with a lot of the other branches of the military, when I talk to people who have been in other departments of it, the whole superior inferior thing is such a massive part of it, of you have to follow it because I'm your superior officer, even if you're telling me that like it doesn't make sense and it's wrong. Like,
I have found that is much more a personality thing than it is a service kind of thing.
Really?
Yeah, most definitely. It's because I'll give you an example. So my last job in the Pentagon, there was somebody between me and the 2-star admiral that I was supporting.
Mm-hmm.
If there was something I needed to talk to with the admiral, I didn't bother talking to this like one person in between, because what are they going to talk about, right? It's like, I need to talk to the admiral about this. And I'm the one who the weird thing about being in the Pentagon is there's a very, very small number of experts, because there's so broad a breadth of, such a breadth of things you have to talk about.
Right.
So if you wanted to talk about my programs, the integrated undersea surveillance system, I was one of 3 people in that building who could talk intelligently about that topic from one end to the other.
Which is insane to me that you said it's one of 3, because the Pentagon, which I don't think people realize, it's a city. It is a massive.
Every day, 25,000 people to go to work there.
In one building. Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm saying. Like, to have 3 people is insane. But it makes sense, because if you think about like you said, the breadth of everything that, defense is for a massive country on a global scale, it is an insane amount of tiny little things.
So then Ted Branch retires from the Navy. And now, in order to talk to the admiral, I've got to go through 3 people.
Yeah.
You just can't do it. And I'm convinced it's her personality was just, I can't be bothered.
Yeah.
So
that's fascinating.
So other stuff is on your submarine questions.
I mean, general life on the sub.
So let's just take a typical day, and we operated on a 24-hour day, but the crew is mostly in 3 shifts on 6-hour watches, which means you have an 18-hour day.
Right.
and it kind of rotates backwards, which, trust me, after 2 days, you forget what freaking day it is. You have no idea.
That was actually one of my questions I was going to ask you, was if you had a semblance of time when you're on a sub or not.
Yeah, you do. So most of the crew is in a 6 on, 12 off watch rotation.
Yeah.
There are rare exceptions when the officers aren't in that kind of rotation because we just have enough people that maybe we're in 6 and 18 off, right? So you're in a 24-hour day. Today, the submarine force has shifted to 3 8-hour watches so that the whole crew is in a 24-hour circadian rhythm, right?
Yeah.
But when I was in, we hadn't figured that out yet. So, so to look at this as a schedule, let's just say you've got the morning watch, which means you're on from 6 to 12.
Mm-hmm.
So you're going to wake up at about 5, eat some breakfast, get back to the either get back to the engine room or doing a tour of the area that you're going to be taking responsibility for, either the engine room or the forward spaces, for about 10, 15 minutes. Show up somewhere around 15 minutes till the hour.
Yeah.
To do turnover with the person who's currently on watch. Take the watch, be on watch for 6 hours, get off watch, do a tour, eat. So now you're talking it's probably 12:30 to 12:45-ish. You probably got a little bit of time there. There's probably training in the afternoon.
Yeah.
So let's just say you're planning on doing drills. Those will probably start at 1. So you've got some time between then and say 1. But the drills are going to go from 1 till 4. Which is going to involve the entire ship on a submarine. There's no such thing as drills that involve some of the people. So until 4, and then you're like, well, let's see. Now I'm in a quandary.
Yeah.
Do I eat dinner or go to the rack? Because I have to be up at 11 to take the watch at midnight.
Is rack what you refer to as like your bed?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Rack time is sleep time.
It makes sense because I'm guessing because the way the beds are stacked in a submarine, they call it a rack for that reason.
Yeah, there's for most of the crew, to include most of the officers, you have a space that's, I think, 6.5 feet long, not quite 2 feet wide, and above your noggin is probably 18 inches.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where you're sleeping.
Yeah.
So it's relatively close quarters, right? So you think about that schedule. If you're going to go and get a little bit of sleep before the mid-watch, which is highly advisable, you've probably got an hour or two available.
Yeah.
So in that time I just told you, I've got about 3 hours off.
Yeah.
In an 18-hour day. And in that 3 hours off, most of the crew is doing qualifications. So they're studying things. They're going to other crew members and trying to demonstrate their knowledge and get signatures on their qualification cards. There's other administrative things you have to do. Like, it doesn't matter what job you have as an officer. There's probably some documents you're required to review every day just to keep things going, whether you're talking preventive maintenance records or training records or preparation for what you're going to do tomorrow, or, hey, we've got to get drills ready for tomorrow. So there's all that work to do to get those things even approved. And then on those days which line up correctly, you're going to take an hour and a half of your time and watch a movie in the evening. Yay. and that's like, you can only afford to do that once, probably maybe twice per week based on your sleep cycle.
Yeah.
But the thing is, even if you get a little more senior on the ship, some of the crew refer to like the executive officer and the commanding officer as day walkers because they're on a 24-hour schedule. Yeah. So they're always sleep at the same time, get awake at the same time, but usually some hours that are not the common. And but even that, it's like, even as the commanding officer, I mean, I felt like I was probably working 17 of the 24 hours I was awake.
Yeah.
It wasn't like I was. Boredom would be a luxury if you could find that. It's just, I had time to read, but depending on what was going on in the evenings when I had to be awake, even though there wasn't anything for me to really do, I had to be awake and alert and ready to respond to whatever's going on. So, but it was, I think most people on submarines and on the smaller surface ships too. Well, the surface ships are different because they have just a lot more people. Yeah. So a submarine is about the same size as a destroyer. The destroyer's got 3 times as many people.
Yeah.
it's got more space to have those people.
I was gonna say,
So
it's
most of the
probably
surface,
like subs, like are their holes, I would imagine, are much thicker, and like to deal with all the equipment to deal with like the pressurizing and all of that, like less room for people.
yeah. Well, it's so if you're talking pounds displacement, right? Surface ships are just bigger, right?
Yeah.
So a 9,000 ton destroyer is this huge beast because it's displacing the water and you got all this extra space. It's just air, right?
That's
In
true.
a submarine, you're displacing it with this compressed gas cylinder, and it's only what's in between.
Yeah.
And it's much, much, much harder. So let's say a surface ship, when you look at that thing, you're probably seeing about 70% of it is visible above the waterline.
Yeah.
Well, that's all just space.
Yeah.
Right. It's just
true.
space. And on a submarine, it's just so much smaller. The widest corridors on a submarine are still not 3 feet wide. So no matter where you go, the two most common words you hear on a submarine are, excuse me, because you're always just passing people like at really close quarters. Right. And it's just,
I thought you were gonna say like excuse me and ow. Like for some reason I like just hit your head on the, because I've walked through subs before, and like I know that the doorway, for lack of a better word, is one, you have to step over, and two, sometimes you have to duck down depending on your height.
Hatchway, yeah. So
hatchway, there we go.
Yeah. So I during my time in submarines, there were very, very few Virginia class submarines. Today, they're growing in numbers every year. But the vast majority of the submarines at the time and the majority today are still Los Angeles class submarines. Well, I was on that nuclear propulsion examining board job, and I did exams on a lot of different submarines.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that is amazing about 688 class submarines is how similar they all are as far as their physical arrangement goes. So once you learn that thing right there is going to bump your head, you bob the same direction on every single ship you're on. and you maybe get tagged like once because they're all the same. 637 class submarines, which was the first type of ship I was on, was not like that. There was a lot of variation. They were built at many different shipyards, and there were a lot of things weren't controlled as tightly as they were on 688s, where they were all the same, right? And there's an advantage to the same, because you could go from one ship to the next ship and it's like it's the same.
Yeah, I know everything.
And so the training time, it's like Southwest Airlines, right? All they fly are the same model as 737.
Mm-hmm.
You can swap crews on planes anytime you like. It's a piece of cake. Well, that's what the fleet had when almost every fast attack submarine was a 688 class submarine.
I would assume you were pretty much always submerged when you were traveling long distances. Like y'all probably didn't do much traveling at the surface, did you?
Yeah, it's you don't want to. It's difficult to operate very close to the surface of the water.
Yeah, because
the amount of controllability you have is low, and if you're that close, then so that superstructure on the submarine, you got the steel, like, hull of the ship, the round part, and you've got this like square part that's above the water. So that's referred to as the sail, and that sticks up another 15 to 20 feet above.
Right.
So the closer you get to the surface, the closer you are to having the sail actually break the surface of the water.
And the whole point of a submarine is not to be seen.
Not to be detected. Absolutely right. The unclassified maximum operating depth for U.S. submarines is 800 feet, and it is noticeable definitely on the ballistic missile submarines. The amount of hull compressibility is absolutely noticeable on the ballistic missile submarines, because they're, I think, 42 feet hull diameter. And so you can find a video of this on YouTube. You go to the midpoint of the submarine and you tie a string across there up at the surface, and you tighten it as tight as you can. It's like it's a guitar string. Yeah. And then you go to 800 feet and it's got this noticeable dip in the thing.
Wow.
Yeah. So the hull is compressed enough that you've got a dip in the wing. So it's not something you notice like walking around the ship. What you do notice, though, is atmospheric pressure changes. One of the things that is submarine disqualifying is being able to use the Valsalva technique. So being able to plug and clear your ears right? So this whole kind of thing. If you can't do that, like if you have a cold, it literally drives you bonkers because the pressure in the ship changes all the time. So you've got high pressure air on board the ship that's stored in banks external to the ship, and that's used for various systems on board the ship. Well, that bleeds air constantly into the hull of the submarine, which makes the pressure go up in the ship. So you're constantly monitoring the pressure in the ship, the percentage of oxygen in the ship, and the percentage of carbon dioxide in the ship, because those things have, as you might expect, specific limits on what you can do there, right? And so you're always monitoring those. Usually it's not a problem. Sometimes it can be a challenge depending on what atmosphere control equipment you have is not working as good as it should be, or if you're not able to operate some of that equipment for various reasons like sound quieting. But the pressure in the ship is always something that you'll notice, because when it starts to get higher, like I said, if it changes rapidly, you're like clearing your ears all the time. When the ship comes to periscope depth and you need to ventilate, so like say change out your atmosphere for some fresh air, if the difference between inside the ship and the surface of the ocean is different by just a little bit, your ears are going to pop when you do that, right? It's like you do it it's about 50 feet of elevation change at sea level, and you'll have to clear your ears or you do something, right? Well, on a submarine, that happens all the time, right? So if the pressure goes up in the ship over time because you've let air get into the ship, and now you need to do an air charge to put more air back into the air banks, as soon as you start to change that air pressure, your ears are going to pop again.
Wow.
And it's just constant. So if you're on a ballistic missile submarine, when you're going to launch the missiles for real, you pressurize those missile tubes with nitrogen. And so the entire missile, there's a lot of empty space inside the missile. It's like a rocket. There's a lot of empty space in there. It fills with nitrogen. And then it would just vent, because when you launch the missile, the nitrogen would just vent up out of the tube, right?
Right.
Well, when you do it for training, you pressurize those tubes with air, because pressurized nitrogen costs you money. So we just pressurize those tubes with air. Plus, if you pressurize them with nitrogen and you don't launch the missile, there's no way to get rid of the damn nitrogen. That's more of a problem, right? So you pressurize them with air, and then you bleed the air back into the ship when you're done with the test.
Yeah.
So when you're underway on a ballistic missile submarine, for portions of that time, you're called what's called alert, which is you're in constant communication with the shore, such that if they send you a message to launch missiles, you can do it as fast as you can, right?
Yeah.
So you're in 100% communication. And occasionally, in the middle of that, they'll send you a test message, which is just, okay, spin up your missiles, get ready for launch, and tell us when you're done. Just to confirm that whole process works like it's supposed to.
Right.
So they call that thing a WSRT. Don't worry about what it stands for. And when I was XO, we had all these Panasonic Toughbook computers on the ship, right? I mean, we had 50 of these stinking laptops on the ship, right? So every time we did that drill and we vented all that pressure inside the ship, and the pressure goes up quite a bit. I mean, quite a bit. Like, I want to say I've seen 900 millibars. Atmospheric pressure is 750. And it's a lot of, the ship is big, but it's a lot of air.
Yeah.
24 missile tubes is a lot of space. And when they vented the tubes, the N key on my Toughbook would get stuck. So if I opened the lid on my laptop, there would just be this of N's. The N would just go across here over, and I was like, I'm gonna have to come back in 2 hours when we've done an air charge, and I can use my computer. Stupid crap like that. All right, so I know we're gazillions over time.
You're good.
So only three things that I absolutely did not like about commanding a submarine.
Oh, lovely. I love this.
So the first one is telling crew members that loved ones have died.
Yeah, I could imagine that's absolutely horrifying.
Yeah, I won't give you any great sea stories there. Suffice to say that the piece of advice that somebody told me was, and this still doesn't prepare you, is you literally have no idea how that person is going to react when you tell them that news.
Yeah.
Because few exceptions, it's unexpected.
Right.
And no matter what you think you know from talking to people about the relationship they had, you don't know.
Yeah.
And how that person's going to react has no bearing on the nature of that relationship or how good or bad it was. It literally doesn't matter. So that was always just horrible. Mm-hmm. and you never have perfect information. Sometimes it's really bad information. And I learned that lesson on my first ship. We did a mission off Central America, and we're headed back north. We're going to make a port call up north. And I come off a watch one day, and the XO says, "Hey, Scott, go. Have you got 5 minutes after dinner? Go talk to the captain." I'm like, "Okay." So I go in, I sit in his stateroom, and he says, "Oh, hey, good evening. How you doing?" I'm like, "Well, fine." He's like, "Well, how things going?" I'm like, "Okay." We have a little chit chat, and he goes, "Okay, I regret to inform you that your aunt, Kathy Merriman, has recently passed." And she was my favorite aunt. My Aunt Kathy lived up in Santa Cruz in California. Yeah. And I was just like, okay. It's just like out of the blue, right? You have no clue it's coming. And even today, when there's things like email, the ship can exchange email with the beach. But we have dirty word checkers to see is something coming across that we don't expect. But for the most part, it's with no exceptions, the CO is going to find out before that crew member does. Yeah. And therefore you get the chance to inform them before they read like an email or something, right? Anyway, so that's number one. Number two, captain's mast. That doesn't mean anything to you. So occasionally people on the ship do things they shouldn't do. And occasionally they fall into the category of illegal in one category or another. Now, this may just be with conduct. I don't mean like they're doing things like drugs or, DUI. But there are other cases where people have committed offenses under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And as the commanding officer, you're judge, jury, and executioner on those cases. Yeah. And in every case, I don't care how justified it was to do the captain's mast, it's a complete waste of my freaking time. Yeah. Right? It's a complete waste of my time because it should never have come to the point where this is what happened. Yeah. Whether it's his fault or somebody, it was so bad because, I had 3 DUI cases when I was commanding officer, which are like one of the heinous things you can do in the submarine forces, do something like that. And it gets a lot of attention and everything. Right. And so you're having to take these young people to court. Yeah. And weigh them and dispense justice, which in no way brings any kind of satisfaction to you at all. At all, it's like, yeah. I have to do it. It's not like I want to. It's just, it sucks, right? So those were always bad. I didn't have that many masts when I was a captain, but anyway, none of them are ever good. So that was number 2. And number 3 is a goofy one. Mooring the ship. So this is, getting underway, leaving the pier, going out to sea, no problem. Yeah. But coming into port and then going up against the pier and throwing over lines and tying the thing up, I hated that evolution. Because it's like the bow of the ship is a fiberglass dome. Yeah. The stern of the ship has stern planes, which have vulnerable surfaces. And you're tying up against the pier, which has agreeably some standoff stuff, called camels in there. But if you get the ship pivoted just slightly, you can get one of those things to touch before the other thing does. Yeah. And so it's just, and you have like very little control because you got a couple of tugs that are lashed up to you trying to push you up against the pier. And it was always I just found the thing very, very unnerving and aggravating the whole time. And no matter how good you do, it always feels like you fucked up. And I know people who don't feel that way, but that was, for me, that was number 3. It's just mooring the ship was always like, I just hated it. I just, every time. And you do it a lot, right? Every time the ship leaves the pier, you're going to come back. or at least, that's the minimum success criteria is that you come back. The number of dives equals the number of surfaces. That's always a good thing. So those are my three. I know that my first two are probably pretty common. I don't know anybody who is fond of those first two. Yeah. And the third one, I don't know. I don't know what other people fall out on this scale. You'd have to find some other CO to ask what your thought was about, what are the three things you didn't like about Command? And I don't know, I may be one of those weird people who actually gave it some thought. Maybe everybody else just goes, gee, I don't know. Let me think about it. But those things are always on my mind. It didn't take me very long to figure out what those top three were.
Yeah. It was great catching up with you and talking to you again after so long, and really fascinating. I like sitting back and just letting you talk. You just story after story after story, and it's great. It makes me happy.
If there's a way that a story can illustrate something we're talking about, it's far more fun to talk about than.
Oh yeah, of course.
Those things are burned in, right? I mean, you don't forget them, which is why it's so effective. So it was great talking to you. It was a lot of fun.
Say hi to Julia again for me, and I hope she wasn't bothered by us taking up your time, even though I've taken up probably 4 times this amount talking to her twice.
I'll keep that in mind. Yeah, it's all good. I enjoyed it. It's fun.
Awesome.